'Cause like a winter tonight, I thought I would always have light. The quick flash that you gave to me, so dark I could barely see. Looking
From wherever you are around the world, welcome and thank you for joining us. Today we're going to be exploring the world of the Constitution. So we're going to have with us Dr. Erwin Chemerinsky. He's a graduate of Harvard Law School and the founding dean and distinguished professor of law and the Raymond Pike Professor of First Amendment Law at the University of California Irvine School of Law. He also has a joint appointment in political science. He wrote this fabulous book called The Case Against the Supreme Court. Let's welcome Dr. Chemerinsky to the circle. Welcome to the circle.
Great to be with you.
So this is a hot topic, especially now as we have the presidential elections already starting. I think it's for 2016. I'm not sure if it's 2016 or 2020. I don't know. They start so early nowadays. But they got some issues already right off the gate here. One of them, I know that people have been asking me, especially when they knew you were coming on to the show, the executive orders by Obama. Is it an overreach? And has it ever been done before? Because I get the funny feeling it's probably been done by other presidents, but we just don't get as much publicity out of it.
I think here you're referring to President Obama's executive order to delay deportation of about 5 million people. And these are individuals who have children in the United States, who have been here for a long time, but are not United States citizens. This is something that many presidents have done. President Reagan, for example, said we wouldn't deport those from Nicaragua, even though they were illegal in the United States. President George H.W. Bush issued an executive order that allowed a couple of million people to remain in the United States who otherwise would have been subject to deportation. President Clinton did it. President George W. Bush did it. The simple answer is that every president can set priorities about who to prosecute or who to deport. It's never the case that every crime gets prosecuted. Possessing a small amount of marijuana violates federal law, but the federal government chooses not to prosecute. Using a credit card illegally is a federal crime, but the federal government is going to prosecute every instance. The government can only deport a small number of the people who are illegally here. So every president sets priorities. All President Obama did was announce his priorities.
Interesting. And what is an executive order for those out there? I mean, can he, not he, but anybody in the presidential seat, I'm not picking on Obama here, but anybody, what kind of rules do they have in regards to executive orders? What kind of limitations and what kind of reach do they have?
First, President Obama did not issue an executive order. President Obama announced what the policy would be. An executive order is more formal. And second, a president can issue an executive order for the conduct of the executive branch of government so long as it doesn't violate any other law. So if President Obama wants to say the executive branch of government and its hiring won't discriminate based on sexual orientation, President Obama can do that because it concerns the operation of the executive branch, of which he's at the head, so long as it doesn't violate any other federal statute.
And the Congress can check him on that?
Congress can. An executive order can't violate a federal law. If Congress doesn't like an executive order, they could pass a statute to override it. Of course, the president could veto the bill, and then they'd have to override the veto.
Sounds like a circus.
Well,
This is very interesting. This is exactly what I wanted to do because we get a lot of stuff in the media. There's a lot of hyperbole, as you know, and I'm trying to clarify that for the audience so they can understand a little bit of what's going on out there. Well, we'll stick on Obama here for a second since he's always on the hot seat around America. Obamacare, now that we have a Congress that's Republican in the House, Republican in the Senate, there's rumors of trying to overturn Obamacare. Do you think that's feasible?
We need to be very precise here. Congress could vote to overrule Obamacare, to repeal the Affordable Care Act. The House of Representatives has voted over 60 times to repeal the Affordable Care Act. However, if the House and the Senate both vote that, the president will veto that bill, and there's not a filibuster-proof majority. There's not enough in the House or the Senate to overcome that. There's, in fact, not even enough in the Senate to overcome a filibuster. So at this moment in time, there is no realistic chance that Congress can repeal Obamacare because the president could veto it And besides that, it's not going to get through the Senate because the Democrats would filibuster it. But there is a case now before the United States Supreme Court. It was argued on Wednesday, March 4th. It's called King versus Burwell. And what the Supreme Court does in that case could effectively end Obamacare. Depending on what the court does, it collapsed the healthcare exchanges that are the core of Obamacare, the Patient Protection Affordable Care Act. Let me explain why.
Yeah.
The act says that every state shall create a healthcare exchange. Congress, though, can't force a state to do anything. So the law says if a state chooses not to do so, the federal government will come in and create a healthcare exchange in those states. At this point, 16 states have created healthcare exchanges. In 34 states, the federal government has come in and created the healthcare exchanges. A key way that the Affordable Care Act makes healthcare affordable for people is that for those of low or lower middle income, they get a tax credit if they buy an insurance from the exchange. There's over 8 million people who have bought insurance from the exchange who are able to do so because they get the tax credit. But the Affordable Care Act says a person gets the tax credit if they purchase insurance from, quote, a state-established exchange. The challengers are saying that the only people who can get the tax credits are those in the 16 states that have created exchanges. That in the 34 states where it's a federally created exchange, they don't get the tax credit. The government is saying the clear intent of Congress, if you look at the language from their perspective, is that people should get the tax credit if they purchase from a state exchange or a federal exchange. That's the issue in King versus Burwell. In the 34 states where there's a federally created exchange, do those who purchase it still get the tax credit? If the answer to that is no, the RAND Corporation has estimated that the cost of health care on the exchanges in those 34 states will go up by 45%.
Wow.
That will price out ever more people, and people believe that that will just collapse the healthcare exchanges in the United States. So, from a practical perspective, whether Obamacare survives is going to depend on what the Supreme Court does in this case. That was argued the first week of March, and it'll be decided by the end of June.
That's a very, very scary result there, if that happens. It's a lot of people could lose health care.
Yeah, and it'll be enormous. In Florida, 1.5 million people are getting health care on the health care exchanges who are benefiting from these tax credits. In Texas, it's 1 million people. If the Supreme Court says they no longer get the tax credits, they won't be able to afford insurance. Just in those two states, that's 2.5 million people who will no longer have health insurance. But if they don't get health insurance, then it changes the nature of the insurance risk pool, drives up the cost for others. Others won't be able to afford it, and everybody believes the exchanges will just collapse.
Well, if I was to give you a Karnak envelope, which way do you think it's going to go?
Before the oral arguments, I thought that the Supreme Court was going to rule against Obamacare. After all, in 2012, 4 justices said that they believed the whole law was unconstitutional. After the oral arguments and reading the transcript, I think the Supreme Court's going to rule in favor of the government uphold Obamacare.
Man, it's going to be an interesting June, that's for sure.
The example you use of Karnak is one that people our age would remember. If I mention Karnak to my students, they have no idea what I'm talking about.
That's good. Now they can Google them. See if they can find them out there. Another hot topic, which actually kind of crosses both aisles in the political world, was the NSA issue. And I don't remember now, you have to forgive me here, kind of escaped my memory for a second. I can't remember if Feinstein was yelling at NSA as well for hacking into her accounts or if it was another agency. But that's been a big issue here. It's a really tough one. And I know you specialize in, I think it's First Amendment rights. What's going on here with the NSA issue?
It's an enormously difficult issue. Because of Edward Snowden's revelations, we learned a great deal more about the NSA's gathering of information. One of the things that we learned was that service providers like Verizon were regularly turning over to the NSA the information about who their subscribers were calling, who they were receiving calls from, how long the calls lasted. This is what you may have heard called metadata. It wasn't that the NSA was getting the content of the communications. It wasn't they got the words spoken or the text written, but they learned who people were calling, who they were receiving calls from, and for how long. You can learn a lot about somebody from that. If somebody is calling a suicide prevention hotline or an AIDS treatment center, you learn something from that. If you know who somebody is talking to, you might be able to figure out who's having an affair with whom. And the government has incredibly sophisticated algorithms to analyze that. And there's a fascinating question. Does it violate the Constitution for service providers to turn this kind of information over to the government for analysis? 2 federal district court judges, one in Washington, one in New York, disagreed. The one in Washington said this violates the Constitution. The one in New York said it doesn't violate the Constitution. And both cases are on appeal to their respective courts of appeals.
Wow. What do you think about that? It's a really complicated issue. I mean, in some senses, we need that to protect ourselves from people that are trying to do harm to America, but in other senses, we're trying to keep our privacy. It's kind of a really complicated one, like you said. Any way you lean?
Well, I come down on the side that if the government needs this information, they should have to show probable cause. They should have to make a particularized need. I do think we have an expectation of privacy in the numbers we call or who we receive calls from.
Let me ask you this question. I was talking to a professor who specializes in advertising and marketing, and they were bringing up a question. There's over 50,000 cameras in stores across the nation, I think maybe more now, that go and look at consumer behavior. So they're looking at Dr. Chemerinsky and see what he's going to buy, how he's moving through the store. Does he linger here? Does he go there? What do you think about that? Is that a constitutional violation as well?
No, for 2 reasons. First, if it's done by a private store, the Constitution doesn't apply. The Constitution only limits what the government can do. It limits what a government building can do, but not what a private building can do. It limits what a government university can do, but not a private university. Second, in terms of other law, so long as it's public areas, there's no invasion of privacy. We don't have an expectation of privacy. We're in a public place. So if I'm walking down the street and the city wants to have a camera to watch people walk by, if they want to have cameras at intersections to use going through the red light, we don't have an expectation of privacy. We're on a public street or a public road. Likewise, when we're in a store, if the store wants to have cameras there, they can have cameras there. Not in bathrooms. We do have an expectation of privacy if we're in a bathroom. So if the store tries to put a camera there to make sure nobody's shoplifting, and the camera can see people using the restroom, that would be an invasion of privacy. But so long as it's just monitoring people on the aisles of the store to make sure there's not shoplifting, to make sure that they're keeping track of how people behave in the store, that's not an invasion of privacy. The key is when we're in public places, we don't have an expectation of privacy that the law protects.
Perfect.
Hi, welcome to Adelante. This is Adelante Recovery, and my name is Yvette Kuglin, and I'm part of the staff.
Adelante Recovery Center has helped people in dual diagnosis for 5 years. We accept most PPO insurances and provide luxury accommodations and 24-hour support. To speak with an admissions counselor, call 1-888-242-4450.
A lot of time we don't even know what's wrong with us, and sometimes we need to get away to figure that out. So if you want to go for a little retreat out in Corona Del Mar, which is a confidential location, we're here to help. So we're only a phone call away. Thank you.
Marijuana legalization. I think there's 23 states now that are it's legal to use it. Do you think this will ever go to the Supreme Court?
Well, it has this. I think we've got to be very careful by what we mean by legalization. Yeah. Many states, and I think this we're referring to, have said that it will no longer be a crime in those states to use marijuana for medicinal purposes. They allow medical use of marijuana because marijuana has been shown to treat certain conditions, say like glaucoma. There are only 2 states to this point that have recently, and this is Washington and Colorado, that have said that possessing less than an ounce of marijuana is not a crime in that state. Now, even in these states, that doesn't make marijuana completely legal relative to the states. It's just less than an ounce. However, marijuana still violates federal law. So even in Washington or Colorado, having less than an ounce does not violate the state law, but it still violates the Federal Controlled Substance Act. The federal government's not going to prosecute somebody for less than an ounce of marijuana, but it still violates federal law. So there is no state where marijuana has been completely legalized, and there's no state where possessing more than a small amount has been legalized other than for medicinal purposes. Will it go to the Supreme Court? I don't think so. I don't think that the Supreme Court's ever going to say that people have a constitutional right to have marijuana. I think it's just something that's worked out in the political process. The only thing that may go to the Supreme Court relatively quickly is states near Washington and Colorado have brought a lawsuit saying those states' legalization of marijuana of less than an ounce has put an unfair burden on the states that haven't legalized marijuana, and they're bringing a challenge on that basis. And that's pending in the Supreme Court now. We'll see if the Supreme Court takes the case.
That's interesting. I didn't even think about that. That's a good point. Just out of curiosity, has there ever been another law that where it's a state law and but against the federal law? Are there too many of those?
Sure. What's important to realize here is the federal government can prohibit whatever it wants. And so the federal government prohibits possessing of marijuana. States can also have laws that prohibit marijuana, or a state can choose to not have a law that prohibits marijuana. Or a state can have a law that prohibits marijuana except for medicinal use. So there are many things that violate federal law but not state law, or state law but not federal law. I'll give you an example. Murder is a crime in every state, but murder is not a federal crime, with exceptions like on federal property or a federal officer or the like. So the federal government can have a law that prohibits marijuana, but if a state doesn't want to, it doesn't have to. That doesn't give you a defense if you're prosecuted under federal law. It just means you can't be prosecuted under state law for that.
That's fascinating. So another couple of questions here. Roe versus Wade. Are we going to see that coming back up again?
Absolutely.
Really?
Between 2010 and 2014, 240 laws were adopted by 31 states restricting access to abortion. And these took all sorts of different forms. Some states tried to prohibit abortion at earlier stages of pregnancy. Some tried to make sure that a doctor had to give the pregnant woman a description of the fetus, even show her pictures of the fetus at that stage of pregnancy. Some limited the ability to use drugs like RU46 to perform induced abortions. Some limited private insurance companies from paying abortions. Some said that in order for a doctor to perform abortions, the doctor would need admitting privileges at the local hospital. And the hospitals wouldn't give those doctors admitting privileges. A case about that coming out of Mississippi is likely to reach the Supreme Court next year. I don't think that this will be the question of whether Roe versus Wade should be overruled. I think it's just a question of what kinds of regulations are allowed. But when the regulations are onerous enough, they can restrict how many places are available for abortions and make abortions far less available. On the current court, I think there are 4 justices who would overrule Roe: Roberts, Scalia, Thomas, and Alito. There are 4 justices who would continue Roe: Ginsburg, Breyer, Sotomayor, and Kagan. I think that leaves Justice Kennedy, and his position is likely to be he won't vote to overrule Roe, but he will vote to uphold many laws regulating abortion.
That's a safe middle ground right there. Well, we got a couple more questions, and then we have what we call the fastball question, which I didn't prep you for, but we never prep our guests for that, but we'll get to that in a little bit. So you'll see that one coming at you. Sovereign citizens, how do they work? I know Texas has always been a place where they're always looking to secede from the rest of the country. Some of the people, not everybody in Texas, obviously. And they're sovereign citizens there. How do they fall in regards to the Constitution, in regards to state law?
I don't know what you mean by the phrase sovereign citizens. That's a phrase I don't know.
There's some organizations that claim that you can renounce your citizenship and become a sovereign citizen, so you don't have access to the police department, to emergency care, none of that, because that's a government
This is just a, I don't want to put it too pejoratively, a theory without any legal basis. There's no such thing. It doesn't exist.
There you go.
A person could renounce his or her United States citizenship and go live in a foreign country, but there's only two categories. There's citizens and non-citizens. If you're a citizen, you're a citizen. There's no distinction. There's no such thing as a sovereign citizen as opposed to a non-sovereign citizen. There are a lot of people like tax protesters and militia people who develop that whole thing about sovereign citizenship. It doesn't exist. It's a fiction of their imagination.
Great. I like it. I like it. Last question before our fastball question. The future of the Supreme Court. Do you think you'll see any changes? Do you see any upcoming rookies, per se, coming into the Supreme Court in the next 5 or 10 years?
In the next 5 to 10 years, definitely. Ruth Bader Ginsburg has just turned 82 years old. Justices Scalia and Kennedy are turning 79 this year.
Wow.
Justice Breyer is turning 77 this year. Most justices in the last 50 years have left the court in their early 80s. Some have stayed longer. John Paul Stevens stayed till he was 90. Some left earlier. Justice O'Connor left when she was 75. But I think whoever's elected in 2016, especially if it's a two-term president, will likely get 4 vacancies on the court. I think between now and 10 years from now, which is the number you pick, I think Ginsburg, Breyer, Scalia, and Kennedy are all likely to leave the court.
Well, it's going to be a very interesting 10 years if that's the case. I'd like to have a study done one day on the judges because it's amazing how bright they still are, how sharp they still are. I mean, there must be some kind of scientific study. If you become a judge, you're just kind of like immune to Alzheimer's or anything else.
No, unfortunately, that's not so. I wish it were.
Oh.
Thankfully, on the Supreme Court, only rarely in American history are there been justices who remained after they were mentally failing. But there have been instances in American history, and there are too many instances of federal district court or federal court of appeals judges who have life tenure who are no longer intellectually capable of performing. It's one problem with giving somebody life tenure, and there's really no process of impeachment for removal. Now, what we do know, and this isn't my field, is that one of the most important things for remaining intellectually sharp is remaining mentally active. And obviously, the Supreme Court justice and federal judges do that. But it's also a matter of the luck of genetics and the luck of environment. And there's no reason that a Supreme Court justice, by virtue of that appointment, is less likely to develop dementia than anybody else. We just hope it won't happen.
That's great. I was trying to give a dissertation study for one of the students, but oh well. Are you ready for your fastball question?
Sure.
All right. Well, in the conservative world, you always have somebody who brings this up every so often, especially Mark Levin. He always likes to bring up the con. So, what is your opinion about the con, the Constitutional Convention? Is it a good thing, bad thing? Don't even talk about it?
Article 5 of the Constitution says that if 2/3 of the states ask for a constitutional convention, Congress shall call for one, and then anything it proposes becomes part of the Constitution if ratified by 3/4 of the states. We've never used this procedure. The last constitutional convention was in 1787. We've done well overall without a constitutional convention. I'm not sure what the Constitutional Convention is seeking to do that we can't do without one. We can amend the Constitution. It's been amended 27 times. We can do future amendments. There's a great deal that can be done without constitutional amendment by statutes. So what I've never been persuaded of is, what's this supposed to achieve? The Constitution has done so well for this country for so long. Why do we want to use a procedure we've never tried?
That's a great point. Last question before we go. Any cases that you should, besides the one you mentioned earlier about Kane, any other cases that we should keep an eye on this summer?
Sure. On April 28th, the Supreme Court will hear arguments in 4 cases coming from Kentucky, Michigan, Ohio, and Tennessee as to whether state laws that prohibit marriage equality violate the Constitution. The court's going to decide, is there a constitutional right to marriage equality for gays and lesbians? Nothing the Supreme Court has decided in years is more important than this.
Really? Interesting. Why do you say that?
I don't know the percentage of the population who are gay and lesbian, but what this really goes to is will gays and lesbians have equal respect, equal dignity, equal treatment under the Constitution?
That's a big thing. Dr. Chemerinsky, thank you so much again for being on The Circle. That was wonderful stuff. Here's the book, The Case Against the Supreme Court. I'm telling you, you're not going to find anybody who knows the Constitution as well as Dr. Chemerinsky. Once again, thank you again for being here. Thank you, everyone. Remember, our motto is simple. Wherever there's psychology involved, whether it's in the Constitution or not, we're going to be there. We'll see you next time, everyone.